It was a Friday evening, a rare kind of evening when the world seemed to take a breath, as if the universe itself had decided to slow its pace. The sun had just set, casting a golden glow over everything, bathing the city in a soft, almost ethereal light. Time felt stretched, lingering, offering the space for reflection, for the mind to wander. I stood there on the balcony of a high-rise, looking out over the city, the warmth of the air carrying with it the promise of something unexpected, though I couldn't yet place what it might be. Robert, my husband, had invited me to a formal dinner for his company that evening, a celebration of another successful quarter. These kinds of events had become routine for me. A crowd of familiar strangers, faces that always felt more like passing shadows, names I could barely recall, exchanged with only the most superficial pleasantries. Yet, tonight, something felt different. There was an air of anticipation that hovered just beyond my reach, teasing me with its mystery. Robert was in his element as always, charismatic, effortlessly charming, and the center of attention wherever he went. His handshakes were firm, his laugh hearty, his presence commanding the room. He moved through the crowd like an actor on stage, engaging here, cracking jokes there, ensuring that he made the rounds and checked in with all the right people. Meanwhile, I had slipped into my usual role, an observer, a quiet spectator at the edge of it all. The hors d'oeuvre table became my haven, a place where I could retreat without drawing too much attention. The glass of Chardonnay in my hand was almost a comfort, a way to give my hands something to do as my mind wandered. My heels, as they always did by the end of these events, pinched at my feet, a constant reminder of my discomfort. Next time, I promised myself I'd wear navy flats. That was when I first noticed Michael Sterling. Michael wasn't just Robert's boss. No, he was more than that. He was the kind of man whose presence seemed to dominate a room without him even trying. Tall, with silvering hair that seemed to shimmer in the light, and a posture that spoke of years, even decades, of experience. He carried himself with a kind of quiet authority, as though he had seen and done things that most people would never even begin to imagine. I'd met him once before, just a brief handshake, a polite, "nice to meet you," at a prior company event, but tonight, his gaze found mine and it lingered. It wasn't just a passing glance. It was as if he had noticed something in me, something worth seeing. His eyes were steady, intense, and for a moment, I felt exposed, like a book whose pages had been turned too quickly. He approached me slowly, almost deliberately, with an air of ease that made it seem as though he had all the time in the world. His smile was small, but inviting, and when he spoke, his voice was deeper than I remembered, carrying a warmth that seemed to soften the distance between us. "Eleanor, right?" he asked, his words smooth, like the comforting hum of a well-loved record playing in the background. "Yes," I replied, slightly taken aback by the fact that he remembered my name. "Nice to see you again, Mr. Sterling. Please, call me Michael," he said, waving off the formality with a small, graceful gesture. He glanced around the room, his eyes flicking to the other guests, and then back to me. "Would you mind stepping out onto the balcony for a moment? It's quieter there. I'd like to talk to you privately about something, if you don't mind." The request caught me off guard, and I hesitated for a moment, unsure of why I felt compelled to agree. But there was something in the way he asked, something in his voice that made me want to follow. It wasn't a flirtation or a hint of something inappropriate. It was simply a quiet invitation to step away from the noise, from the surface-level chatter, and into a space where perhaps something real could be said. We stepped out into the cool evening air, the faint scent of jasmine floating on the breeze. The city stretched out beneath us, its lights twinkling like a constellation made of human lives. The hum of the party inside seemed distant, almost as if we had crossed some invisible boundary, entering a world of our own. We leaned against the railing, the cool metal grounding us in the stillness of the moment. Michael exhaled deeply, as though he, too, needed a moment to gather his thoughts. For a while, neither of us spoke. We simply stood there, looking out at the city, as the night wrapped itself around us. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice quieter now, a softer edge to it. "I hope I'm not overstepping," he began, his words slow, deliberate. "But I've been meaning to tell you something for a while now. Something I think you should know." He paused, as if choosing his next words carefully before continuing. "I've noticed the way Robert talks about you. It's not something I see very often, how he speaks of you with such reverence. It's clear to me that you've made a real difference in his life." I blinked, unsure of how to process his words. There was a part of me that wanted to brush it off, to downplay the importance of what he was saying, but another part of me, the part that had been craving something real, felt a stirring in my chest. Michael's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something more than the polished veneer of a powerful man. I saw a man who had been touched by loss, by grief, and whose heart still carried the weight of it. He gave a small, rueful laugh. "I suppose that sounds strange," he said, his voice tinged with self-awareness. "But the truth is, I've seen it. The way Robert lights up when he talks about you. How eager he is to share even the smallest detail of your day. I don't know if I've ever had that kind of connection with anyone. Not since." He trailed off, and for a moment, the words hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. "I lost my wife to cancer 8 years ago," he continued, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain. "She was my rock, the one who made everything else possible. Since then, I've kept people at a distance. At work, I'm fine. But personally, I've been somewhere else entirely." There it was. The grief, raw and unfiltered. The loss that had shaped him in ways I couldn't yet fathom. His words struck me like a chord plucked from a forgotten melody, one that resonated deep within me. For a moment, I felt the weight of his pain as if it were my own, and I realized then that this conversation was not just about Robert or me, it was about him, too. "I'm sorry if I've made you uncomfortable," Michael said quickly, as though suddenly realizing the depth of what he had shared. "I just wanted to tell you that you remind me of something important. You remind me that connection still exists, that it can be found even in the quietest of places, like this conversation here on a balcony." I stood still, my heart hammering in my chest, not sure how to respond. His words had hit me harder than I expected, and for a moment, I couldn't find the words to match the depth of what I felt. There was no flirtation in his tone, no inappropriate motive, just an honest, vulnerable exchange between two people who, for just a moment, found something real amidst the facades of their lives. "Thank you," I finally said, my voice soft but steady. That's very kind of you, Michael. I think we all need reminders like that sometimes, don't we? Reminders that we're still seen. Still important." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, and we stood there for a long while, simply absorbing the silence. After a pause, Michael turned his gaze back to the city below, lost in his thoughts. Then he looked at me again. "Would you mind walking with me for a bit? Around the terrace? I'd like to hear more about you. Not the stories Robert tells about you, but you, Eleanor, the real you." I nodded, not because I wanted to be flattered, but because, in that moment, there was something in his words, a quiet invitation to be heard that stirred something in me. I hadn't expected it, but I found myself wanting to be seen in a way that I hadn't been in years. So, we walked. The night air on the terrace was cool, with a softness that seemed to hush the chaos of the party inside. The chatter, the clinking of glasses, and the thumping bass of the music felt like distant echoes, muffled by the solitude of the space we stood in. It was as if the world had momentarily slowed down, giving us a rare moment of clarity. As I ran my fingers through my hair, the breeze tousling it with a light, almost playful touch, I realized how long it had been since I'd allowed myself to truly breathe, to just be. And then, without warning, words I hadn't spoken in years came tumbling out. "I used to paint," I found myself saying, my voice almost a whisper, as if the admission was a secret. "Watercolors mostly, landscapes, quiet scenes. But I haven't touched a brush in ages." Michael's eyes, always so focused, softened at the mention of art. He tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to see past the surface, to understand the weight of those words. "Why did you stop?" he asked, his voice carrying a sincerity that made my heart ache just a little. It wasn't a question out of politeness, but genuine curiosity. I hesitated, the silence between us stretching, filled only by the distant sounds of the party. The question felt like a door I hadn't noticed was there. And now that it was open, I wasn't sure if I wanted to walk through it. But the words, as if guided by some unseen force, spilled out anyway. Life got busy, then it got quiet. I began, my voice trailing off. The memories stirred within me vividly, but fleeting. And then it just became routine. Everything started to blend together until I couldn't remember why I used to love it. You forget about the things that made you feel like you. The words hung in the air, heavy with an emotion I hadn't expected to feel tonight. Vulnerability, regret, but also relief. Because for the first time in so long, I had voiced something true. Michael didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stood there, his gaze fixed on me, contemplative. And then, as if he understood a part of me I hadn't yet found the courage to acknowledge, he spoke again. "That's the hardest part, isn't it?" His voice was quiet, but it seemed to resonate, like a chord struck softly but with perfect precision. Losing pieces of ourselves while we're busy taking care of everything else. I felt a lump rise in my throat, an emotion so sharp it almost hurt. It was as if Michael had put words to the ache I had buried deep within. The ache of forgetting who I was, of surrendering parts of myself to the demands of life. I nodded, unable to speak, my chest tightening with an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us now different, shared, unspoken. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was the kind of silence that happens when two people have connected on a level that transcends words. Michael shifted slightly, and for the first time that night, I noticed the way his face softened. He seemed younger, in that moment, not the polished professional I had met earlier, but a man who had lived, who had experienced the weight of his own silent battles. "What about books?" he asked, his voice gentle. "What did you used to read? What kind of stories made you feel alive?" The question felt like an invitation, a safe space for me to unfold a part of myself I had long hidden. "I used to read everything," I said, smiling softly as I began to remember. "Fiction, mostly. Mysteries, historical novels, poetry. I used to lose myself in them. The kind of books that pulled you into other worlds, made you forget the one you were living in just for a while." "And music?" he asked, as if the question was just as important. I smiled, the answer coming to me easily. Music was my escape. I used to listen to jazz. The kind that made your soul feel something it couldn't quite name. The rhythm, the melody, it was like a conversation without words. There was a pause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a connection. A bond, not just between us, but to the parts of myself I had forgotten to care for. Michael was no longer just a man I barely knew, but someone who understood the weight of what it meant to lose yourself, even when you were just trying to survive. "And you?" I asked, my voice soft. "Curious now. Before all the work and the life you have now, what were you like?" His smile was small, almost wistful. I was the same in a way. I used to love hiking, spending hours outdoors, getting lost in the quiet of nature. But life, it just got in the way. Responsibilities, expectations, it all piled up. "And you forget." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. Life had this way of creeping in, filling up the spaces we didn't protect, until we were left with nothing but the echoes of who we used to be. The night wore on, the party continuing inside as we stood there on the terrace, the world moving around us while we stood still. No demands, no obligations, just a simple exchange of thoughts and memories. It wasn't grand. It wasn't life-changing. But at that moment, it felt like it was. And as we finally turned to head back inside, the party pulling us back like a tide we couldn't resist, I knew something had shifted. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing dramatic. But there was a subtle, undeniable change. We were no longer just two strangers caught in the whirl of life. We were two people connected by something deeper than small talk or social niceties. It wasn't romantic, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. And maybe, just maybe, I had seen myself again too. The days after that first conversation, those fragile, tentative days, felt like stepping into a world that had been waiting for me to come back. Each moment was small, but it felt like a rediscovery, as if I were finding pieces of myself that had been tucked away in forgotten corners of time. It was as though I had been asleep for years, and now, finally, I was waking up. I started noticing the little things: the smell of fresh rain on pavement, the way the light slanted through the kitchen window in the morning, the rhythm of my own breathing when I woke up. All those tiny details I used to take for granted now felt significant. One afternoon, while rummaging through the attic, I stumbled across a dusty old box. Inside, there was an old set of watercolor paints. They were worn, their cases chipped, but the colors inside were still vibrant. I hadn't painted in years, not since I was a child. I had forgotten the way the brush felt against the paper, how the paint seemed to dance and bleed into one another, creating something new with every stroke. I held the brush in my hand, unsure at first, but then dipped it into the water and onto the paint, watching as the first stroke bloomed on the canvas. It was as if something inside of me stirred, something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. The next few days were filled with moments like that. Small things, but they made all the difference. It wasn't just about finding forgotten hobbies, though. It was about finding myself again, about recognizing the parts of me that had been hidden under the weight of years and responsibilities. It felt like a slow but steady unraveling, as if I were peeling away layers of someone I didn't even recognize anymore. Then, out of the blue, I received an email from Michael. It was brief, but there was a weight to it, a sincerity that made my heart flutter just a little. "Eleanor," it read, "I've been thinking about our conversation. It stayed with me in ways I didn't expect. If you ever feel like continuing it over coffee, I'd be honored." There was a moment of hesitation, just a breath, a pause as I read those words over again. I had to admit, the thought of seeing him again filled me with a mixture of curiosity and something softer, something I hadn't expected to feel. But I didn't want to overthink it. I didn't want to let fear or doubt hold me back. After a beat, I typed back, "I'd like that," I wrote. No pressure, just a quiet corner to continue what we started. The decision, though simple, felt significant. It felt like stepping into the unknown, but not in a terrifying way. It felt like taking a small, brave step towards something that had been buried inside of me for far too long. We met a few days later at a small cafe downtown. It was one of those tucked-away places, the kind you almost didn't know was there unless you were looking for it. The air inside was warm and smelled of coffee beans and cinnamon, and the low murmur of conversation added to the cozy atmosphere. It felt like the outside world had been left behind, and for a while, it was just us. No grand gestures, no expectations, just two people sitting down to talk. We started slowly, picking up from where we had left off, but it was different this time. There was a comfort in the silence, a shared understanding that allowed us to be completely present without feeling the weight of what came next. We didn't rush the conversation. We didn't try to fill every pause with words. It was simply about being seen, about letting the connection between us breathe without forcing it into something it wasn't. At the end of the afternoon, when we stood up to leave, Michael paused by the door. I turned to him, expecting him to say something casual or even to bid me farewell, but instead, he just looked at me with those quiet, searching eyes of his and said, "Eleanor, I know this might be complicated, but I'd like to keep talking with you. No expectations. Just a friendship, if that's okay with you." I felt a small knot in my chest loosen. It wasn't what I had expected him to say, but somehow, it was exactly what I needed to hear. There were no pressures, no hidden agendas. Just the promise of a conversation, of a continued connection, and a chance to rebuild something that felt like it had been lost. I didn't need to think long before replying. "I'd like that too," I said softly, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. I think I've forgotten what it feels like to simply be myself. The words lingered between us, unspoken but deeply understood. And in that moment, I realized that it wasn't about him, not really. It wasn't about Robert or any of the other pieces of my past that had shaped me. It was about something far more personal, about rediscovering the parts of myself that had been buried, neglected by years of routine and expectation. It was about learning to be me again, without the weight of anyone else's expectations or the roles I had been playing for so long. As I left the cafe that afternoon, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the first step forward had been taken not just toward him, but toward myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally heading in the right direction. Life has always been a whirlwind, never still, always in motion. There was always something to do, something to solve, something to worry about. It was the kind of existence where days blurred into one another, and weeks felt like they were slipping away without leaving much behind. But something had shifted within me. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began to move through it all differently. The world hadn't changed, not really. But I had. I became more present, more aware of the moments that had once passed me by without a second thought. It was as if I had been living with my eyes closed, and now, for the first time in years, I was seeing things clearly. The way the sunlight poured through the windows in the early mornings, the soft hum of the world outside my door, the delicate way the breeze touched my skin. I started to notice these things that had always been there, but had felt so insignificant before. And then there was Michael. He had always been a part of my life. But those quiet moments we shared became something more. I didn't realize it at first, but somehow, our conversations began to stitch together the pieces of me that had been missing. It wasn't anything he said or did that sparked it. It was more like his presence made me feel safe enough to peel back the layers I'd buried deep within myself. The fear, the doubts, the things I had pushed away in order to keep moving forward were no longer as suffocating. In those rare, fleeting moments of silence with him, I started to rediscover parts of myself that I had lost long ago. It wasn't the grand, dramatic kind of rediscovery you read about in books. There were no epiphanies or earth-shattering revelations. But there was peace. And that was something I hadn't known I'd been craving. What I found wasn't something that threatened the life I had. It didn't demand that I change everything or abandon the things I had worked so hard for. It was something that made me feel more whole, more connected to myself. The frenetic energy of my daily existence didn't feel as overwhelming anymore because I had found a stillness, a quiet place within me where I could retreat when things got too loud. And sometimes, that was enough. It was in those quiet, almost sacred moments with Michael that I felt myself returning to who I was before life had swept me up in its chaos. I felt a kind of clarity that had been elusive for so long. But the clarity wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about solving every problem or figuring out every detail of my future. It was about accepting the present as it was and finding beauty in the stillness. So, I picked up the watercolor brush again. Not because I felt like I had to, but because I wanted to. The brush felt familiar in my hand, like an old friend I hadn't seen in years. With each stroke, I found a little more of myself, my creativity, my imagination, my joy. It wasn't about creating something perfect. It was about rediscovering the process of the way colors swirled together on the page. The way the water would bleed into the paper and create something beautiful by accident. It was in those moments that I realized that I didn't have to be perfect, that it was okay to let things happen, to let life unfold without the constant pressure of control. Sometimes that's all we really need, to find those quiet parts of ourselves that had been lost, tucked away in the corners of our minds, and to allow them to breathe again, to find peace in the small moments. To be present, even when the world around us continues to spin relentlessly. And as I moved through my days, I did so with a new sense of calm. The chaos was still there, of course. There were still things to do, people to please, challenges to face. But I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I knew how to find my way back to that stillness, to that quiet space within. And in that space, I felt whole more than I had in a long time. Because sometimes, the most profound changes don't happen in dramatic bursts. They happen in the quiet, in the subtle shifts that go unnoticed by the world, but change us forever. And that was exactly what had happened to me.